Whether you're an old school punk rocker, a punk rock TikToker, or just a hardcore poser like me, you love everything about punk rock. Its rebellious spirit, its inherent inclusivity, and maybe even the music itself. But not all punk is the same. Some punk rock is hard, fast, and full of raw emotion. Some is super hard, super fast, and overflowing with raw emotion. But most punk is just super shitty, like a toilet overflowing with raw sewage. Fortunately, punk rock has gone through several different eras, and knowing about the different times in punk history make it much easier to separate the trash from the clash, the bands that you want to forget from bands like Minor Threat. And since there's nothing more punk than taking thousands of diverse bands and cramming them all into just a few neat little categories, that's exactly what I'm going to do in this video. Number 1. Classic punk. This was the era that started it all. I'm talking about mid to late 1970s bands like The Clash, the Sex Pistols, and the Ramones. You know, the bands you tell everyone you're a huge fan of, even though you never actually listened to them. But that's okay. If you've heard one Ramones song, you've heard them all. I'm pretty sure they only have like 3 songs anyway, because the only ones I ever hear anywhere are Blitzkrieg Bop, I Want to Be Sedated, and Beat on the Brat. The only Sex Pistols song anyone knows is Anarchy in the UK. So don't worry about it if you don't listen to a lot of classic punk. No one does. It hasn't meant to be listened to in decades. Now it's purely just for show. Nothing tells the world what a cool, modern punk you are like sporting classic punk merch. If you don't already have a Black Ramones t-shirt, run down to Walmart and get one. Maybe get a Sex Pistols patch from Amazon to slap on the battle vest you also got from Amazon. And that's all you really need to do to show the world how much you love classic punk without actually having to listen to that slow, boring, ancient crap. But even if you don't listen to any classic punk, you have to respect it. Normal rock conventions be damned, these bands would search and destroy the status quo in rock music, paving the way for the next era of punk, which, in reality, was the only true era of punk. Number 2. Hardcore punk, aka real punk. I was born just in time to miss the brief period when true punk rock existed. By the time I was old enough to go to shows in the early 90s, all the really good punk bands had broken up. Some of the mediocre ones signed to major labels, and their music eventually turned to shit. But for a brief moment in time, from about 1978 to 1988, there existed this wonderful thing called punk rock. Real punk rock. I'm talking about what we now call hardcore punk. Bands like Minor Threat, Black Flag, Bad Brains, Reagan Youth, Dead Kennedys, Verbal Abuse, 7 Seconds. You know, real punk. In fact, they were so punk that they didn't even really refer to themselves as punk back then. Just hardcore. And hardcore these bands were. They didn't give a fuck. They sang about crazy shit other rock bands never would have, like stealing people's mail, hanging skulls on their walls, and not getting fucked up on drugs and alcohol. Not getting fucked up. Imagine that. Straight edge. These bands put out records and toured the country without the backing of a major label. None of them did it for the money or fame. So why did they do it? Because they were punk as fuck. That's why. At the time, these real punk bands might have been out of step with the world, but they helped pave the way for punk's popularity to eventually rise above other genres of rock. But since these are real punks we're talking about, they knew that swimming in the mainstream is such a lame dream. Many stayed true to their DIY roots, wanting nothing to do with major labels and corporate media. Some even called for MTV to get off the air. But they could see the writing on the wall. A big takeover was about to take place. The hardcore punk bubble was about to pop, and the pop punk bubble was about to blow up. Number 3. Pop punk. Record labels are great at discovering raw, underground music and watering it down, dumbing it down, overproducing it, mass-producing it, and then massively profiting from it. In the early 1990s, the majors set their sights on a few yet-to-be-exploited music scenes, most notably hip-hop and punk. Both genres started on the streets with lyrics about things like social issues, political injustice, and self-sufficiency. But after the big record companies got involved, punk songs went from being about high self-sufficiency to having low self-esteem, from being about the scene to being about some new girl you're seeing. In other words, from punk to pop. And as soon as punk mixed with pop, you couldn't keep them separated. By the mid-90s, pop-punk dominated the airwaves. Welcome to pop-punk paradise. Before then, if you wanted to hear punk rock, you had to actually go to a show. But now you could just turn on MTV or the radio. Once bands like Green Day, Rancid, and The Offspring came out to play, punk rock reached the masses. But as time went on, Music became more pop rock and less punk rock. The attitudes and ideals that once defined punk rock went right out the window. The music no longer mattered as long as it was still played somewhat hard and fast. Now it was all about image. If you looked a certain way, you were punk. What was once aggressive, underground music only for outcasts and weirdos now had turned into melodious music the whole family could enjoy. Once I started hearing old men and little girls alike singing along to songs like Ruby Soho and Self-Esteem, I knew that real punk rock was truly dead. But a lot of early pop punk was actually really good. Bands like Bad Religion, NoFX, Green Day, Sublime, and others got started long before playing in a punk band could land you $1 million record contract. Before Rancid was all over MTV, half the members were in Op IV. All these bands might have had lots of dollar bills in their hands by the mid-90s, but they also had lots of true punk spirit in their hearts back in the 80s when such a thing might have existed. Since these bands got started long before punk was cool, their early music retained at least some level of authenticity. But by the mid to late 90s, when punk CDs and Warped Tour tickets were selling like crazy, selling out became the thing to do. Everyone wanted to jump on the punk rock bandwagon, and a new era of punk was born. Number 4, poser punk, aka corporate punk. By the late 90s and early 2000s, punk rock no longer existed on the streets or in small shady clubs. Now it existed in shopping malls and sports arenas. Anyone with a few bucks to spend could become punk overnight. With just one trip to Hot Topic, you could go from preppy to punk in the blink of an eye. A few pins and patches, a checkered belt, a bottle of Manic Panic, and maybe a studded armband was all it took to complete the punk rock look. The poser punk look. Since punk rock had become both popular and profitable, and you no longer had to be even remotely edgy or original to play it, lots of young bands wanted to get a piece of that sweet poser punk pie. So tons of punk bands started popping up in the hopes that they could sell out fast. And many did. Record labels were quick to sign the punkest of the punk. The punkest looking, of course, not the punkest sounding. The bands with the punkest image. Record labels came up with a simple plan to take all their newfound punk bands and make ridiculous sums of money off them, and that's exactly what they did. Poser punk bands like Good Charlotte might have made bad music, but they sure made good money. Bands like Rise Against would rise with other poser punks up the Billboard charts. Though it might have seemed complicated to people like the poser punk queen, in reality, it was quite simple. Look punk rock, play pop rock, make mad guap. Lots of bands were happy to cash in on the punk rock gravy train. And of course, the corporate world was more than happy to exploit punk bands and fans alike, squeezing every last dollar they could out of both. But even though many punk OGs, well, OPs I guess, had walked away from the scene years earlier and wanted to smash up the watered-down corporate punk rock of the 2000s and beyond, there was one good thing to come out of it. This mainstream poser punk helped a whole new generation of punk rockers to discover earlier eras of punk when the music was actually good and the people making it were actually punk. Number 5, post-punk. Isn't punk at all. It's right there in the name. Post-punk. Post means after, so post-punk means after punk. And if it came after punk, it can't be punk. Same with pre-punk, aka proto-punk. If it came before punk, it can't be punk. Proto-punk and post-punk are about as punk as Post Malone. Interestingly, a good rule of thumb when trying to figure out if a punk album is good or not is to give it what I call the Malone test. If the album was released before Post Malone was born in 1995, in other words, if the album is pre-Post Malone, there's a good chance it might be decent. If it's post-Post Malone and came out after he was born, there's a good chance it sucks. So remember, pre-Malone, decent, post-Malone, sucks. And there you have it. 50 years of punk rock history smashed down into just a few short minutes. Thousands of bands crammed into a few simple categories. And now that you've listened to me tell you about all the different eras of punk, it's time that I tell you the punk rock truth. It's all bullshit. That's right, it's all made up. There are no eras or waves of punk. Sure, punk has evolved over time like everything else. But any attempt to neatly organize punk bands into arbitrarily chosen eras or even subgenres is doing a disservice to all of punk. How can you reduce a band like The Damned down to a single era? They've been around since the damn beginning and are still killing it today. Or how can you reduce a band like Rancid or Bad Brains down to a single punk subgenre when their music, like many punk bands, has elements of several? Punk isn't meant to be organized and categorized. It's meant to be experienced. To even try to define what is or isn't punk is to miss the point entirely. It's not about the sound or the look, and it never was. It's about the spirit, the emotion, attitude. Got to keep that PMA. That's the beauty of real punk music. It can sound like anything. It's about being different. It's about not conforming to bullshit norms, including musically. There are bands out there today that might not look or sound punk, but if they have the attitude and the spirit, I say they're punk as fuck. Anyone telling you that punk rock is dead is full of shit. Anyone telling you it's still alive is full of shit too. The truth is somewhere in the middle. But you don't need me or anybody else to tell you what is or isn't punk. The only thing I can tell you for certain is that if you're one of these people on Reddit or TikTok who's constantly asking, is this thing punk? Is that thing punk? Then you are definitely not punk. Because there's nothing less punk than trying to be punk. And there's nothing more punk than not giving a shit what anyone thinks is or isn't punk. And now that I've told you that eras and genres are arbitrary and meaningless, you tell me in the comments what your favorite eras and subgenres of punk are.
You're so annoying.
If you want to hear some of my music that definitely is not in any way, shape, or form even remotely inspired by punk, click the link in the description or search for this dude on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever else you usually listen to music that is definitely not at all in any way, shape, or form even remotely inspired by punk.